Morning and welcome to this SISTRA sponsored session on integrated land use and transport planning. This follows a session that we ran last year with Landor, looking at the benefits of integrated land use and transport planning. We will put the link to that in the chat for anybody that missed that. My name is Emma Anforth. I'm an Associate Director at SISTRA. I sit in our movement and place team, where we are very passionate about the integration of land use and transport planning to create better places. And that stems from the local plan process right through to the urban design of new development. So today we're looking at the tools for understanding and predicting the integration of land use and transport. And we have got 4 great speakers today. And those are Amy Beasley from National Highways, Katie Adams from Connected Places Catapult, Ed Parham from Space Syntex, and Tom Simpson from SISTRA. And we will have 10 minutes presentation approximately from each of our speakers. And then following that, we will take questions. So if you could put those questions into the Q&A, please, rather than the chat. Questions in the chat won't get asked, so if we could put them in the Q&A, that'd be perfect. And without further ado, I will pass over to Amy. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks very much. So I'm Amy Beasley, and as of about 3 weeks ago, I started as Senior Economic Development and Spatial Planning Manager at National Highways. Thanks. Next slide, please. And next slide again. Thanks. So hopefully today I want to share with you a little bit of an insight into how we as National Highways approach spatial planning, reflect on how we are currently engaging with others when we do that, and then just to round off with some thoughts on how we could collectively perhaps do better. Thank you. Next. Thank you. So just by way of background, National Highways are responsible for operating, maintaining and improving the strategic road network across England. So that covers 4,500 miles of motorway and major A roads, as well as all the accompanying infrastructure with that as well. Next slide, thanks. So just to bring that to life a little bit more, so that accounts for about 95 billion miles of travel on our network every year. That's carrying 3 times as many people as the rail network, and interestingly, it accounts for nearly 3/4 of all freight movements. Next slide, thank you. So what we do know is that usage of the SRN is forecast to continue into the long term, but we also know that the nature of that usage, who's using it and how they're using it, is likely to change. Next slide, please. So as we're planning spatially, as we're looking strategically, we're very aware of some of these challenges and opportunities. So things like electrification, connected and autonomous vehicles, and also the need to make sure that our network is resilient to the effects of climate change as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of our role in the planning process, we are a statutory planning consultee. We're one of the largest, so we receive around 3,000 planning applications every year, but we also see it from the other side. So we are an applicant ourselves, and we therefore manage to see the planning process from both sides of the table, which gives us quite a unique insight. Thank you. So our approach to spatial planning is informed by the DFT Circular 01/2022. So I've included the link there for you if you want to have a look at that in more detail. But that sets out the role that we have moving towards zero emission transport as a statutory planning consultee. So it aligns very closely with the MPPF, making sure that we are promoting development in the right places, that's supported by the right sustainable infrastructure. So what that means in practice is that we will be, and we are working very closely with local authorities to move away from a predict and provide model, instead trying to do vision-led planning, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But basically that's working with communities to identify the outcome that they want to achieve in their area, and then providing the transport solutions needed to deliver on that. Thank you. So in order to move towards vision-led planning, we all need to be thinking strategically. And I think it's important to reflect that that idea of strategic depends on who you are. So as a national organisation, we need to be thinking nationally strategic issues, but we also need to understand those regional and local strategic issues and how they interact. So we have various tools that we use to try and articulate our vision for the SRN and work with others on their visions as well. Thank you. So one of the tools that we're using is making sure that we have a really coherent and aligned set of short and long-term strategies and priorities for the strategic road network. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see connecting the country. That is our long-term strategy for the SRN up to 2050. That then is underpinned and coordinates with our road investment strategies, which are 5-year funding blocks granted to us by the Department for Transport. And those in turn are informed by and underpinned and supported by our annual delivery plans. So it's really important that we have both a long-term vision, but also shorter term as well. Thank you. Another tool that we are using at National Highways is our route strategies. So again, I've included the link here if you'd like to find out more. So these break the network down into 20 key routes, and we're instead planning across those routes. So looking at the local plans and priorities along those routes, what the network is like, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and how we might interact with some other transport networks, such as rail. These reports help us identify again, opportunities and challenges and potential areas for further investigation, so that colleagues working on local plans are able to see some of the challenges and opportunities in their areas and how they interact with their neighbours. Thank you. Another tool that we have is our Planning for the Future guide. So this was relaunched at the back end of last year. Again, this is available on our website and the link is available there. So this sets out how as National Highways we interact in the planning system. So really setting out how we want to be a proactive planning partner, involved as early as possible, so that we can work with colleagues to consider the best places for development, making the opportunities that are around our network, sharing our data, sharing our expertise and intelligence, and making sure that we're really clear on, first of all, the potential impacts of new development on the SRN, but also how we might best deliver that new development. Thank you. So we're really pleased with those tools that we have. We feel that they're useful, particularly to local authorities when they are looking at local plans, and hopefully for developers when they're thinking about planning applications, but we can always do better. So we really recognise that trying to plan strategically, trying to take that vision-led approach with over 300 local planning authorities is really challenging. And it's particularly challenging because we recognise that there are some real resource issues in terms of planning departments across the country. That makes things more tricky. We're really pleased that the government has recognised the need for us to be involved really early in the process as a statutory consultee, and we continue to work with them to understand what vision-led planning looks like. In that vision-led approach, we think there is potentially a greater role for regional, combined authorities, subnational bodies to try and help shape those visions. And we really think that there needs to be weight given in the local plan process beyond administrative boundaries. So instead looking at functional economic areas and supply chain. I mentioned earlier on that the network supports around 3/4 of freight movement. So things like freight and logistics are really, really important to us, and issues like that, using our data, using our expertise with partners, we think that we can be taking a much more national view of that, rather than it being planned for through the planning process in a piecemeal way, perhaps being looked at as an employment opportunity rather than as a utility and a piece of infrastructure in its own right. So just some thoughts there to finish off on our experiences so far in spatial planning. I have included the links for the various resources, so if you would like to find out more, please do have a look at those, or feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Amy. Having worked on the spatial planning framework for national highways for the last 17 years, I think it's really interesting to see the changes in policy, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they get ingrained and implemented over time. It's still a relatively new policy, and I'm sure there's lots of questions perhaps from the group on that and how things are being implemented on the ground. I think we were due to pass over to Katie, but I think
I'm here.
You're here, Katie. Fabulous. I will pass over to Katie. Yeah, off you go, Katie. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks Emma. Hi everyone, so I'm Katie Adams, I'm Urban Innovation Team Lead at Connected Places Catapult, and I'm also Technical Lead for our research into integrated planning, so we take quite a national view on this. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm not sure if all of you will be familiar about Connected Places Catapult, but we work with the UK government, and we're the innovation accelerator nationally for cities, transport and place leadership. So we look at the intersection between technology, new innovation for places, and how that can be scaled for the better. So we look at challenge definition and particular use cases of most promise for that. So we're not a software development house. We scope the need and the opportunity for tools at a national level and look at the opportunities for connected intelligence. So I'll be speaking a bit about, where we've come from in this space and a couple of case studies. So if we go to the next slide, just as a bit of a recap on where we started. So back from 2015 onwards, we really looked at plan tech as a movement, and we saw this emerging market opportunity. So we started looking at the role of data in the planning system, first of all. And if we go to the next slide, we're still in an industry where we're putting things on lampposts, which for any other sector just feels a bit crazy. And we've got lots of really valuable data locked in PDFs. And this was very much the case back in 2015. And we looked at calling the market to develop tools to tackle this problem, and also calling for better guidance to create more consistency in the way we manage and share data to plan places better. So and the next slide shows the fact that we started looking at this as a connected system. So we started prototyping, but also thinking about the governance system around how building information modeling can then connect back to the planning system, and how monitoring processes could improve. And I think the really exciting thing about this is what became a small movement, it is now something set in national legislation with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, setting data standards and power to collect data. So going from prototyping to actually being mandated at a national level is really exciting. So I think we can very much say digital planning is no longer optional. But really moving on from that conversation, we started prototyping infrastructure. So the next slide shows a little bit of some of our early prototyping, where we worked with Belfast City Council to really look at the role of utilities and consolidating planning development information in one place, which I believe will be on the next slide. And this was really about, if it loads, yeah, this is just to give you a sense of these early prototypes that we developed. And there's really now quite a thriving industry looking at this. But this was really in the early stages, working with Belfast Council as a user and delving into those needs and connecting with software developers to be able to do this. And our key learning from this was utility data is really, really hard to get together, but we can get there and we can prototype it and demonstrate the market need. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit more about a particular use case that we focused on more recently. So I think the plan tech agenda has really got traction, and it's really got national scale at the moment. But I think what brings this all into sharper focus is what we call the decarbonisation imperative. And so we started thinking about data and tools, but we're also thinking more and more about the governance processes by which decision-making happens. And we think this is an ongoing barrier to integrated planning. And the decarbonisation imperative just puts this all into sharper focus. So this is really a key use case that we've been looking at more recently. And, I've just put some key challenge points on the right here. So we know that our transport sector and our residential emissions have largely remained unchanged since the 1990s, and that's a massive problem for us, whilst the energy supply sector has reduced quite significantly compared to other nations. We also know that many local authorities have set themselves really ambitious and impressive 20 net zero targets, but are only directly responsible for a short proportion of that local area. So this points to a need for real cross-sector collaboration between asset owners, but also with the private sector as well. So ultimately, we're talking about fundamentally changing the way we plan our spaces. So the next slide just shows some of our kind of barriers. So we've spoken to about 40 plus organisations in this space over the couple of years that we've been doing this. There's a lot of ambition in this space, but some really key blockers, and we've bucketed them into two areas really. One being about governance, accountability and scaling impact. So we found that there was no single point of authority or incentive to really coordinate these net zero approaches. And then on the data side, we know that there's a lot of really great work being undertaken in each of the transport, energy and housing sectors, but these are still modeled quite separately, and that data sharing is really a critical pain point. We also know in the built environment sector, there's real challenges with actually monitoring. So a lot of modelling of emissions is actually done through modelling rather than actually validating that against real data. So we've defined the political objective of net zero, but the challenge remains in really scenario modelling those most local level feasible actions between these sectors. So if we go to the next slide, we've set out these 4 opportunity areas of what both public and private sectors can do about this. And we think it's really for the public sector at a national scale to set and standardise that data and show the market there's that expectation there, as well as those centralised guidelines, so that the market can start to build these tools, knowing there's a market for them. And in the next slides, I'm just going to show a couple of case studies of where we've started to do this. So this first example is where we've worked very closely with the Department for Transport to take a cross-Whitehall approach to using data to lead development. So this is about, an area that's very complex across government and across national levels. This was really about how can we define what a sustainable location actually is. We know it's mentioned in the National Planning Policy Framework, but it's not actually defined, and it's defined locally in various ways, leading to various outcomes. And ultimately, we're seeing a nation with quite high housing targets that it needs to meet, but also a decarbonisation agenda. So how do you reconcile those, and how do you stop homes being built in car-dependent locations? So this is a really macro level challenge that the government is looking at, but fundamentally it's what is the purest way to measure how connected any given geographical point is, and how can you do that in a consistent way across the country to make better decisions about new development. So if we go to the next slide, we started prototyping the art of the possible in this space, and a key inspiration for this as well was, you think of the London public transport accessibility levels, which was really tied and mandated to policy decision making around how many car parking spaces new development could have. And so whilst there are a lot of tools out there that exist that measure accessibility, our hypothesis is that if you have one pure measure that is mandated and integrated into policy, new scenario modelling can be built on top of that, and it can be modelled. So we brought together data sets in transport, land use and planning data more generally, and developed a conceptual methodology for how you would develop a heat map of how connected a place was in 100 by 100 grid squares across the UK. And we called this the Amenity Accessibility Index. So while the public transport accessibility levels in London were a really good way of measuring how connected you are to public transport, it didn't measure where you were going to. So this is what we're trying to do in this index measure, is to get a measure of what key amenities you could access from any given point by low carbon modes of transport. And this is something that the Department of Transport has since taken, and it's scaled nationally, and it's worked with this data science team to develop this into what is now called the connectivity tool. And there will be various announcements and launches of that soon. It is currently in beta testing, and we're supporting them with user testing with local authorities as well. So if we go to the next slide, I think I've made my key point of the fact that this is coming soon. And it's not meant to detract from the tools currently on the market, but it's meant to provide this quite pure, apolitical and objective measure of how connected a given point is to help with decision making. And this is going to be supported by cross-Whitehall policy as well. So we're engaging across the Department of Levelling Up as well as Active Travel England to make sure there's a mutually supportive policy framework around this. The other case study I'm just going to point to very quickly on the next slide. Some of you may be aware we do quite a lot of work around digital twins. We've got a digital twin hub that brings together innovators and digital twins, but also users and data owners. And so this is an example I'll show of our climate resilience demonstrator. So it looks at bringing infrastructure data from across sectors together to scenario model key points of failure. So this looks at climate adaptation and flood risk. So what are the cascading failures if your flood defences fail? What happens to your communication networks, and what happens to your power? This was a very hard thing to do, I'll say, connecting data across utility companies, which have very complex business models and governance structures. So this is an early prototype working with those data owners, BT, Openreach, UKPN, and Clean Water. So on the next slide, it's just a quick illustration. There is a video on our DT Hub that looks at this in more details, but by bringing this data together, you would be able to see on a geospatial platform the criticalities and the measures and the cost of failure of each of these connected systems. On the next slide, in terms of the data on this, we're working on a federated digital twin model. So each company keeps access and ownership over their data. It's not one database, but there is a model that calls in all these different data sets and pulls them together to visualize them. We are also looking at new use cases for this. So really interesting is integrating transport data into this to understand access to those emergency services and the flood impact and the power cuts and their influence on transport. So we're working with users to look at that use case. And we're also really interested in the housing side of things as well, and how houses are impacted by this, which is particularly pertinent at the moment. So I think just to finish off on the next slide, some key takeaways. I think with all of these projects, we've found time and time again that sharing trusted and reliable data across these organizations with different business models, with different interests is very, very hard. But there's a high level ambition to do it. And it's critical. So although it's hard, it's very worthwhile, and we're beating the drum about it as much as we can. We can make tools, we can have the data that's out there. There's a really thriving community looking at this, but we need to create those incentive chains for organizations to start to share their data and to start to scale it across organizations. So there are these use cases that bring them together, and there's accountability for doing it well. And I think the challenge Connected Places Catapult we give to ourselves as well is we need to get really practical about what we mean about integrated planning and what it means to professionals and planners day to day. I think in industry, we tend to sort of talk about planning as if it's one thing, but what does it mean depending on where you work in that quite complex system? So that's a challenge we have to ourselves as well. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Katie. I think that was, really interesting. Some of those outside of transport, things that were layering up, which, sometimes at kind of early local plan, deciding which sites to bring forward. It's not just always about transport. We can say transport is in, the best site for transport is this one, but it could be those kind of infrastructure and service kind of constraints that might mean that we end up with different sites. And yeah, I think having a consistent data set and an evidence base earlier in the process is absolutely critical to getting those right sites across all kind of elements of planning. So thank you for that. That was excellent. And we'll now pass over to Ed.
Hi, so I'm Ed Parham. I'm Director of Innovation and Design at Space Syntax. We're an urban design consultancy. We look at modelling the built environment to understand how it affects daily activities and long-term outcomes. So if we go on the next slide, please. So I think integrating transport and land use, I think often this is what kind of immediately comes to mind is kind of big infrastructure, tall buildings, things like this. And I think just picking up on some of the points that Katie was just talking about, I think it's interesting because integrating those things, it's a principle or it's a design principle, and the intention is that it allows better outcomes to happen. And that means things like making it easier to move around, making places more efficient, more sustainable. And as soon as you start to think about outcomes, moving on one step from the principles of what are you actually doing, the outcomes become really important. And so the question then starts to be, if it's about the outcomes that you want to set in place, if it's around things like health and sustainability, what are the activities that contribute to that? What are the characteristics of the built environment that we can design and we can actually change that allows people to be active every day and enable these long-term positive outcomes? So what I'm going to talk about is actually how we can start to use data to analyze places, understand what these relationships are, how we can identify them and how we can set them in place. And that might mean finding places where they already exist. But I think the key thing is looking across scales, and it's including active transport as well as other modes and bigger scales of movement. So if we go on to the next slide, please. This is a slide that I've used a lot in the last couple of years, but I think the really important thing is that it starts to show a set of relationships across scales about how all of these things fit together. The image on the left, you probably see these stories in the press fairly regularly. New housing developments, people are car dependent, they're really unhappy, they spend the whole time driving everywhere, even though they might be relatively close to an existing town that this is an extension of. The image to the right of that is more and more medical research has emerged in the last few years, linking things like daily activity to health outcomes like obesity. I think that particular paper talks about a reduced risk of obesity in people that take public transport to work. So that's not even active transport, that's public transport. And on the right of the page, you can see that these kind of daily activities, they don't just impact the individual person, but they have societal impact as well. And that includes climate change as well as wider health costs. So on the far left of that, what we've got is where we drop into this process is that what we try and do is take the data on the street networks, the land use, the density, understand how it fits together and how that makes certain activities and daily behaviours possible or not possible, in order that we can then try to create better outcomes or enable better outcomes. On the next slide, please, we can see that actually this is, as soon as you start to talk about outcomes, they're really complex, and we have to be both aware of the role that we can have in shaping them, but also careful not to kind of overclaim things. So this is a complex systems map that was put together by the Government Office for Science. It's looking at all of the factors that contribute to obesity. There's loads of things in here. There's things like age, income, lifestyle, lots and lots of stuff. As a planner or a designer, you can't change those things. But what's really helpful on this, there's a kind of a dark brown box on the kind of the right-hand side of that map, and that is the physical activity environment. And those are the things that we can have some influence over. So what we want to really do is understand how can we make that environment as good as it can possibly be to allow people to be active every day. Now, the word of kind of caveat is to say, because it's complex, we can't guarantee if you make the perfect, most walkable environment that everybody will walk and will be healthy, but you can make it possible. And I think the unfortunate thing is that in the last, significant amount of time, a lot of development has made it almost impossible to be active every day. And you can see that through things like the RTPI report that came out a couple of years ago that found a huge number of major housing developments were almost completely car dependent. So if we go on to the next slide, if we want to understand what are these links between things, we need to be able to think about the data that we have and how it can fit into this chain and this kind of sequence of things which links everything together. So on the left, you can see we've got the built environment that makes decisions possible or not possible. That built environment is important. It works across lots of scales, from the street grid of a whole city to the public realm of a smaller area to the design of individual buildings and the land uses within them. It's important because once it's there, it's almost impossible to change. So you need to get it right from the beginning. To the right of that, within the built environment, we have services like transport layered into it. And transport, some of the services can mitigate an existing constraint in the built environment, but it might introduce its own. It might make it easier to get into the centre of a town. You might be able to get a bus, but the bus might only come once an hour. It might be expensive. It will introduce its own constraints. And we can start to see that affects people's perceptions, that then influences their daily behaviours and activities. And then we get into that story about the individual and the societal outcomes. So if we go on to the next slide, please. What we can start to do, there's lots and lots of different data that's available. But what we really need to do is to be able to position it to understand how to use it and how to get the most valuable value from it. So you have things coming from, might be from GPS or from phones, from sensors. There's lots and lots of data, which is kind of live activity data. And we need to be able to understand how that fits into this chain. Now, one way of thinking of this is if you think of it almost like a simple kind of chemistry experiment where you've got a set of variables, you mix them together in an experiment and you create a result. Now, what we have, the data which is coming out of kind of trackers and things that tell you how many people are in this location at this time, that's essentially result data. That's telling you what is happening, where it happens, and when it happens. And that's helpful because it shows you a snapshot. But really importantly, it doesn't explain why it happens. And we need to understand why it happens if we want to change it and if we want to get different behavior and activities happening. So on the left-hand side, we've got all the variables that we can start to affect as a planner or a designer. And what's really important is to be able to take the data. We've called it this slow infrastructure data or system data because it doesn't change very quickly. And what is important is to understand the constraints that those systems set in place. So what's important is that we need to be able to analyze that system data to understand why something happens. If you don't understand why it happens, you can't change the result. So you need all of this data to work together, but it's especially important to have the system data early on. If we go on to the next slide, I can show how we concentrate on this. And if we go next again, please. What we do is we make what we call integrated urban models. We have one of these for the whole of the UK. This is taking street and pedestrian network data. We can analyze that network by itself across lots of different scales, and that will talk about patterns of connectivity within the network, and we know that affects how people move around. We can combine this with land use data, we can combine it with public transport data, we can analyze each of these layers individually, but if you go on to the next slide, please, we can start to see how all of these different systems combine with each other from the perspective of a person. So this is an image of our walkability index. What the walkability index does is from every house or every building, it will look at where can you move within 15 minutes, what land uses can you get to, how many of them are there, what's the distance to the closest. And we can start to identify places which it's easier to get to more things and places where it's much more difficult. So red is showing you the most walkable places. If we go on to the next slide, please. Then in 2022, we took the data that we have across the whole of the UK, we combined it with some census data, and we made a model that correlates with walking to work behaviour. It gets really high correlation at local authority level. I think we can explain something like 80% of the variance in where people walk to work. At MSOA level, so over 6,500 areas, we can explain more than 2/3. What is really important is that we could start to link, in this model, we were linking the built environment to census data. So it's not just thinking back to that complex systems map, it's not just what the built environment allows you to do. There's all of those other factors. And so we were connecting it to the data about age, to income, to household size. And this is really important because as a planner, again, you might not be able to change all of these things, but you can at least start to respond and react to it. If we go on to the next slide, please. We're partway through an Innovate UK funded project where we've been applying similar techniques to model commuting by car. So what we're able to do now, we've got models where we can predict the number and the distance of journeys by car across every LSOA in the country. We've got, again, really good correlations of almost 0.75 R squared, which is really, really high. And what we're doing is we're linking this to a tool that we're working on with a company called Bioregional. And the purpose of this is to be able to understand where locations are inherently more or less car dependent, and to be able to validate that against actual data. So you can see we've highlighted some factors in red in the model on the right, and these factors are important because these are the elements that you can start to change through planning and design. What the tool is going to do is allow you to allocate housing land, to allocate units to particular sites, to be able to change the number of units, to be able to see what that means in terms of transport created carbon emissions. But there are also elements that start to look at the carbon that is produced through construction and operation of those buildings as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please. This is how we can use this. We can start to see where are there places which are inherently more or less sustainable, places which will require people to drive more to produce more carbon, where are places which are more walkable. And we can start to very quickly see at quite a high level where to put different amounts of housing and what the impact of those different scenarios of allocation could be. We can zoom in another scale, and you can see that on the next slide, where we can extract from the model. We can start to see what's the influence of, say, urban block size on making places easier to walk or more difficult. How does land use distribution work? How do particular characteristics of the street network work as well? And so we can use this at the next scale down. So once you've found the place which is least carbon intensive in terms of transport, you can then start to say, how do you design this particular plan to be as walkable as possible? Next slide, please. And the other thing as well, because we have the data validated about how that systems level data that we have interacts with activities and outcomes, you can then start to see places where either you have a mismatch between what's possible in those physical conditions versus what actually happens, or you can start to see the places where it's very, very difficult to change. Now, once you can see those things, you can then start to think about what do you do about them. It might be really, really difficult to change how car dependent an existing part of a city is. You might not be able to reintegrate it in the way that it needs to, but you might be able to do a softer intervention. It might be around mobility subsidies, or it might be around shared car pumps, or these sorts of things. So you can start to use this data to kind of tailor hard or soft interventions to particular places based on their specific characteristics. So if we go on to the next one, please. This is just the summary. So just to recap, I think integrating land use and transport is really interesting because it begins to be this question about what are the outcomes that we want to encourage, and it begins to be about positive long-term outcomes, whether that's health or sustainability or climate change. To be able to optimize those outcomes, we need to know how the things that we design enable those activities which lead to those outcomes. That needs data, but it doesn't just need data, it needs a framework to think about it. And that's where we have this way of thinking about, there's data that shows you what's happening, where it happens and when it happens, and there's data about why does it happen. And you really need to understand that why to be able to change what's actually happening. Once you know what's happening and why it happens, then you can think about how to change it. And that's where we get into these physical interventions or soft interventions and mitigation measures. So at that point, I will hand back and finish. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, really useful and interesting presentation there. I think, you know, I was looking at that map with the red bits on, which is semi-replicated there. Yeah, it's some really good granular data there for transport, isn't it? But as we kind of know that, you know, we don't always allocate our sites on those best locations, do we? And perhaps, you know, through the questions, we might have to think about the issues why and what we need to do via these tools to try and make that happen. I think some layer in there, perhaps between some of your stuff and some of Katie's stuff might help with that planning picture that I alluded to previously. Now, finally, last but not least, I shall pass over to Tom from Sistra. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining. My name's Tom Simpson. I'm an associate at Sistra. I've spent most of my professional career developing and applying Delta land use transport interaction models. Over that now long period of time, the types of policy issues and the sorts of social problems that they're applied to and that we're looking to solve has changed dramatically. I think that evolution or change continues now. And the focus of this presentation is obviously around improving the integration of land use and transport planning. I don't think anyone's on the other side of the fence about this. The importance and benefits that better integrated land use and transport planning can bring us are so obvious. Though please, in the Q&A, if you disagree, go ahead. So these slides really are talking about the different tools we have to improve that integration, and land use transport interaction modeling with Delta, like I'll show, is just one of those tools. Okay, next slide, please. So for those who don't know what LUTI modeling is, it's a spatial analysis tool. It's obviously looking at the different interactions between land use and transport markets. And Delta itself is a model that forecasts forward over time, and it looks at how those different markets interact and respond to each other over a long time period. So on the right, we have the transport, kind of what's often a typical transport model, looking at the balance between demand and supply of transport and the resulting travel conditions that come out of that. And they pass into the land use model, and it is considering those travel costs and calculating accessibility measures. But it's also looking at the market, a whole range of related markets. And the simplified version here is looking at the supply and demand for floor space and the sort of resulting rents that come from that. And all of those go into understanding how land use and the users of land react to those conditions. The next slide, please. So as I said, Delta is a kind of range of connected markets. We can see those in the center here and the different agents on either side and the different linkages between them. At the bottom, we have the transport markets that we had. And at the top, and relevant to this presentation, is the way developers and developer choices feed into the property markets and therefore location choices. Delta is a kind of behavioral model in the sense that we set it up to within firms and residents to respond to different influences and changes over time. It gives a view of why households or businesses may choose to locate in particular areas and how those location choices change over time. Often the model is tested by holding one of these elements, holding most of these elements constant and varying one of them, so we can kind of cascade different assumptions or changes in assumptions from one market and see how they play out through the rest of the land use model. And next slide, please. You just jump the animations. I think there's 2. Thanks. And one more. This is the kind of overall structure. I think the relevance for this presentation is the mix between detailed bottom-up planning and transport policies at the bottom and the overarching demographic and economic scenarios that ring fence these models. And the value that Delta can give here is the way that it tests the balance between those detailed bottom-up policy inputs and the context that the scenarios give overall. Yeah, next slide, please. Sorry. And this is the kind of overarching rationale behind using LUTI models for integrating planning and transport. So historically, I think land use models have been seen as a kind of an aside or a bolt-on to an existing transport model. They're used in a kind of reactive way, test changes in transport and see what happens on land use. But they don't need to be used like that. We can reframe the position and think of transport as being reactive to land use. And by design, as I showed before, they're connecting a range of different markets to transport, and so we can see how these different markets interact and play out with each other over time. And as I said at the introduction, in integrating planning policy and transport and development is crucial. The location of development is baking in for the long term into transport system, decades of trip making behaviour. And associated with that, there's a whole range of long-term maintenance and support of that infrastructure that local authorities need to fund. And while it's impossible to kind of know perfectly the future and define even what we all might agree on what is an optimum development profile of a particular place, I don't think it's controversial to kind of suggest that individual developers or local planning authorities, when making decisions, don't really face the full cost of their policies or decisions over the long term. So yeah. Sorry, if we go back one slide, I just had a couple more. Ensuring the planning system leads to sustainable development. There's obviously huge external and social costs of allowing the wrong sort of development in the wrong place at the wrong time. And LUTI models are just one of the tools that we can use in order to help help development in a kind of sustainable and planning-led way. Next slide, please. So within Delta, as I said earlier, the real benefit is that it's reconciling bottom-up detailed plans, which are typically derived from local planning authorities, and site level information is translated into the different model inputs and formats that are needed, and they're typically by location, quality, time period, and potentially who the likely occupiers are, and then any information we have over development costs or site costs and whether or not it's a greenfield or brownfield process. And on the other side, we have to define the top level scenarios for the model. So what's the kind of view of growth and employment and population, and we can sometimes stipulate that at lower levels as well. And those scenarios are kind of controlling the context for which development happens in terms of the amounts of demand for homes and offices, and when and where that's likely to happen. And then the land use model itself is really the development model within it is calculating where those planning permissions are likely to come forward and when. So on the left here, and this is non-exhaustive, there's a whole list of variables that come out of the land use model and influence the demand for location in a particular place. And at the same time, there's factors associated with the development itself, or the particular development cost for sites, is there land banking, other coefficients related to how sensitive development is to profitability, and those are all considered by the development model in order to calculate which planning policies come forward first and which are used up over time, and whether or not they're permissions are used or carried over to next year. So the model is reconciling these kind of contextual elements of the overall scenarios with the bottom-up planning policy information, and determining which ones are most likely to come forward given the conditions in the model. Next slide. I've just got a couple of examples. This one's from our London model. The nice thing about the LUTI model is that it has this ability to take site level data and encode it into the model at a very detailed spatial level. The transport model is quite detailed. It's got around 1,500 zones, but the land use model itself is aggregates only 200. But because we allocate the data at site level, we then have the ability to accurately match the uptake of planning policies and development in the land use model to its corresponding detailed transport zone. So with this approach, we're able to much better tie together individual developments to individual transport zones and land use zone. The land use model can still have all the benefits that running strategic model can bring. And the next slide. And this is a in progress research piece we're doing for Fife Council and Transport Scotland, and it's seeing how the land use model can be used from a primarily planning perspective to use the development model as the design, as I mentioned earlier, to see how different planning allocations come forward under different transport scenarios. So national planning framework for Scotland sets out the importance of planning for the long-term public interest, which I think goes back to what I was saying about why it's so crucial that when making the decisions, we try and face the full cost of those decisions. And NPF4 also sets out different regional priorities for the 5 broad regions of Scotland. So it accepts different places have different priorities, and therefore the planning framework must reflect that. So if we move on to the next slide, from my point of view as an operator of land use transport interaction models, the real value comes from using them and running them and exploring the different outputs that come from them. So Delta itself is very easy to make quite broad sweeping policy adjustments, like adjusting the generalized cost for car travel or expanding the stock of planning permissions in a particular area. And in the Fife research we're doing, we are individually testing, what's the view of demographic and economic growth in the area where we increase car costs, we double them or triple them over time. How does that affect where people choose to live and work? And similarly, we're looking at, well, if we expand the supply of permissions for homes or offices, which ones start to get taken up first, and which ones are left unused? And then the process is bringing that all together and seeing, well, how are planning permissions where we add additional capacity or we change the underlying transport conditions, how does that affect which ones are brought forward first? And then last slide, please. So I've been through just how the land use model is kind of handling development and the different case studies that we're using with it. And I think these all fall into the kind of general view that transport obviously must be considered in its wider context. The land use models, land use transport interaction models are really helpful because they allow us to connect transport markets to wider markets. And as I was showing in the examples, it allows us kind of quantitative exploration or testing scenarios of different impacts. And much like within the transport appraisal kind of discussions, scenario planning, different views of the future are really important. And where we've got models, we can test different views of the future, and they, for improving the integration of planning and transport, understanding where development is most likely to come forward in the future world is really beneficial, particularly over the long term. Okay, thanks, Emma.
Thanks very much, Tom. Brilliant set of speakers there, and we've got plenty of questions in the chat. So apologies if I'm kind of looking through these questions to try and link them together, and yeah, so we're not asking the same thing. There's sort of a couple of themes that kind of continue throughout, but then initially, Amy, I'll pounce on you a little bit just because there's a few kind of national highways focused questions that perhaps you could just have a quick deal with before we try and open out to ones that might be a little bit more for everybody. So we've got one from Alex Pringle saying, how are you applying the new vision-led planning approach to existing pipeline projects from RIS 1 and 2 that were developed in hugely different circumstances?
Yeah, so really good question. We're not. So we are still, I think I mentioned in my presentation, working very closely with the DFT and with local authorities to understand how do we do vision-led planning. It is fully embedded within the Connecting the Country report that sets our vision out to 2050. That is already informing our decision making and the process in developing RIS3, which will be covering 2025 to 2030. So it is embedded within that approach, but we're still working it out. And that's partly why it's really fascinating to hear some of these other presentations of how do we use some of this data? How do we try and get vision-led planning in practice? And welcome all the comments and feedback that's coming in through the chat.
Brilliant. Related to that, how will National Highways seek to reduce the projected growth in vehicle trips across the network, which, as it stands, would counteract any motions to consider climate change and net zero targets? And then there were a few questions about how National Highways is looking at decarbonisation, which I know you'll be able to deal with through the decarbonisation plan, but I'll leave that with you as well, Amy, about the projected growth into the future.
Yeah, so I think I've been there three and a half weeks, so bear with me. I think it's probably most helpful to share some kind of practical examples of what we're doing at National Highways around, firstly, trying to reduce vehicle movements, but also the decarbonisation point more generally. So we are, firstly working very closely with Network Rail. So we have a really good partnership relationship with them. We've done a number of shared pieces of work looking at where there are particularly congested corridors and there are rail connections nearby. How can we encourage that mode shift onto the rail network? People may have seen that the minister mentioned before Christmas about an aspiration to increase the amount of freight being transported by rail by, I think it's at least 75% by 2050. Again, that's something that we're going to be working very closely with them. Can we get some of those freight movements off of our network and onto the rail network instead? Second thing I did mention about our route strategies. So again, that's taking a corridor approach. That's looking at how does our network interact with, say, the local road network? Are there particular concentrations of journeys where people are junction hopping? So they're popping onto the SRN, maybe for one junction. The M60 in Greater Manchester is a really good example of where that happens. Are there opportunities for some of those trips to come off our network onto the local road network? But rather than shifting the problem, actually, can we help move those to different modes? So again, it's working with local authorities and subnational bodies in some of our planning of can we encourage that mode shift? And then practically on that, we obviously have our designated funds as part of the RIS programme where we try and invest and provide funding towards delivery of walking and cycling schemes as an example.
Fabulous, thank you. Right, something that might be a bit more for everybody. Got a question from Ian, and conscious that we've been talking about tools today, and this is perhaps more of a strategic question, but I wonder if there's a way the tools could be used. So how does outcomes that communities want in this kind of vision-led planning match with developer requirements to make a profit? Is there a way that the tools can give us early insight and just create sites that are best for everybody, basically? I'll send that to Ed. You're smiling. Don't smile.
I'm trying to do something about it. I think there's a really interesting question in there about how do you engage people to define what outcomes everybody actually wants to get to, and then how do you set in place those conditions? I think that question about developers, that's a bit of a question about how do you unlock the process to make it happen, isn't it? And I think if you can, I can think of a couple of different things. One would be if you can start to use data and analysis and tools to see the impact of development in certain places, you can change allocations so you don't end up with the wrong densities in the wrong places, and that will make certain sites less attractive or more attractive. So you could start to, from kind of a policy point or a regulation point, prevent development in certain places with a bit more evidence. I think the other interesting piece, which there was a question, I think in the Q&A from Nick Falk as well, which was talking about, can you see how land value changes? Because I think that then also becomes really interesting. If you can see, I mean, we did some work a couple of years ago with at that point, it was the Prince's Foundation, the Prince's Trust, now the King's Trust. And that was looking at how characteristics of walkability related to property value. And we're working with Knight Frank at the same time. And one of the things that we were finding was that places that had higher walkability, but also had other characteristics to do with city size and location, you're getting higher rateable values in particular locations. So if you can start to see from, there are locations that might be more carbon intensive in terms of transport, you can see that there are particular areas or parts of town where you might get a high property value, then you should be able to think about how you can kind of marry those two things together at the same time.
Perfect, thank you. Katie, do you want to come in? I know your presentation included the thing about, you know, consulting with people via notices on lampposts. Is there a more sophisticated way we could do that to achieve visions that the community wants?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to caveat that I'm not against lampposts. I know it does work for, you know, some parts of the community. I think it's just, you know, I think there is an opportunity to do it differently. And I would just say that, you know, as part of our plan tech work, there are a number of really interesting SMEs and tools and products out there that look to do this differently, like looking at sentiment analysis as well. You've got the likes of Built ID and Futurebox that are looking at user-led services that allow people to voice their opinions more easily. And if you think about a modular system you know, where you're looking at these models, but then you can start to integrate that layer of sentiment analysis of communities actually having a voice through other means and through these new services and digital platforms, it becomes really interesting when you get these different tools and different services that start to talk to each other as well. And I think there are these tools. There's the importance of modularity, and I think what Ed was saying about the evidence base was really interesting as well. I used to work in public realm negotiations with developers, and the lack of evidence base was something that really frustrated the process of being able to convince a developer that, you know, this amount of green space was actually going to be valuable was a real challenge. And the more we build these data sets that integrate into each other, and the more we build these models that have that evidence, the more we can address the information imbalance that often we see where developers can pay for lots of tools as well, and modelling, and local authorities don't have that same level of information. And I think there's a real opportunity through new tools and through new evidence whereby local authorities have the same data and have that same evidence as a developer would as well, by looking at spaces more widely beyond a site.
Yeah.
Can I add one more bit on this as well? Because I was just thinking through the other issue I think that becomes really interesting is how house builders do their carbon reporting as well. And that if you can see that you're choosing sites which are going to be more carbon intensive over the lifetime of their development, then that's another argument that should be really kind of used to encourage development in the least intensive places, or least carbon intensive places.
And do we have a tool for that?
Well, I think we can start to look at, this is one of the things that we're working on with bioregional. We can start to see, you create this many journeys per year, that will be this much carbon. They're looking at the piece which is around the construction and the operation of the buildings. So you can start to see that. I don't know enough about carbon reporting to know whether once a developer has built the houses and sold them, is it there, do they have to report on it anymore, or is it then outside of the scope of what they need to consider?
Tom, did you want to feed in on that point?
I was going to add that I think the way we consider individual developments, or the kind of the makeup of them, and perhaps associated services like retail or health or education associated with individual developments, and the impacts on trip making behavior out of new developments. That's something that can all be considered in the sorts of models that I build. I mean, I'll just pick up, I think it's really interesting the asymmetry that Katie was talking about, that these tools can only really have value if there's confidence in them, and some of that comes from an openness and accessibility. And if they're used in ways which are kept behind closed doors, or are so complicated that people don't understand them, then they're very difficult to believe. And you know, why, if you look at like individual communities, or there is certainly a kind of a feeling of imbalance between their ability to kind of push against or counteract tools that local authorities or developers have access to. So, yeah, I mean, from my point of view, simplifying that and opening up the outputs and making them visible to everyone, I think it is beneficial. Thanks.
Another question we've got is, how would we enforce a vision-led approach? What happens if the outcomes are not delivered? Does the next development have to do more? Again, it's quite a strategic question, but I don't know if there's a way to apply the tools within the process for this kind of thing. Or Amy, I think perhaps that's a question to you first of all.
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. So, and I think actually stepping back where we are to a question where we are at the moment is how do we know that we've done it right? What does good vision-led planning look like? So that then has to be backed up by monitoring to understand what's actually happening on the ground. It's really, really challenging. So it's a good question. I can't answer it here because it's an open question at the moment. So yeah.
Any thoughts? What happens if we don't meet our visions? What should we do, guys? Better vision, better planning. How can we create a circular process here from the things that we've talked about today?
Just one thought on this. Sorry, Katie, do you want to go?
No, Ed, you go.
Just one thought on this is that I think one of the really important things is setting a realistic vision at the beginning. And without understanding how all of these constraints that you have to work with make things possible or not, then you can't set something that's reasonable, or you might be trying to do something that's not impossible, but very, very difficult. So I think there's a role in here to be able to use data and analysis very early on as part of that visioning process to just set a reasonable objective and allow people to really understand what you can do. Yeah,
it's a great point. Katie, did you want to feed in?
Yeah, I think just building on that really, because in our discussions with organisations, what we found is, although everyone intends to monitor developments, it's really difficult and it's not properly resourced in the local authorities as well. And often it's quite a manual process. I mean, we've heard things whereby you would have to go, authority would have to go in their car and manually count houses, developments to be able to monitor their housing targets. And, that was maybe a year or two ago, but there are these instances where these things are happening and there's no national agreed way of monitoring or resourcing that monitoring. So I think, without that evidence base, as Ed was saying, it's hard to set a realistic vision, but I think there's also a role for policy and to endorse or create a mutually beneficial policy framework that supports the use of these tools and mandates and sets out standards for the collection of data, which would massively help that. And we're starting to see that coming through with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill and the planning system. But I think there's more to be done in thinking about it cross-sectorally as well.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of talk of digitisation, wasn't there, in the Levelling Up Bill proposals. I think that could be beneficial. I think dealing with transport earlier within the local plan process, often we're assessing the transport impacts once the sites have been decided. So I think earlier use of the tools, I think that's something that's come through from a lot of comments and questions, that often these tools are reactive rather than actually perhaps being used in a proactive way around development options earlier in the process. And again, you've got that evidence base there for the political angle and local residents and things as to why those sites are there, rather than actually, sometimes the evidence around the why can be a little bit thin on the ground, I think, from a transport perspective. There's a question here about land accessibility data. So how open is the land use planning accessibility data platform for local authorities? I'm guessing this is perhaps in relation to Ed's presentation, possibly Katie's. Is this something that would be available to applicants and or the third sector as well?
So the data that has gone into our models comes from OS. There's some of the data is licensed, some of it is open. It begins to be quite a complicated combination of things that have gone into it. We have the data across the whole of the UK. We're able to provide it to people, but we can't make it open, and we have to pay a licensing cost for it. So if there's anything which is about anything that's including the land use data and access to particular uses, things like the walkability index, we can make it available, but we have to license it essentially, because some of the source data sets going into it are not covered by things like the geospatial mapping agreement that allows local authorities to use OS data for free. So it's there and it's available, but we have to charge something for it, and we have to pay a royalty back for making that available.
And if it's in relation to the connectivity tool that I talked about with DFT, the intention is that local authorities are the primary users of this. So that would be available to local authorities across the country, because ultimately the objective is that everyone has access to this kind of consistent, more defined version of what a sustainable location is. And I think there was a question of, is there a definition of a sustainable location currently? The main one we use is the National Planning Framework at the moment, you know, which is building for the needs of today without compromising the needs of tomorrow. But you can imagine that the way that's actually interpreted when you're making decisions on where to put houses can be quite different depending on where you are and what data you've got access to. So the intention of this is to bring a little bit of consistency to that across the country for local authorities.
Perfect. How do we create different incentives for the key actors in these processes? So developers, landowners, construction industry, local authorities, to increase the accessibility of existing places and create genuinely accessible new places using triple access planning. Who wants to take that one first? Should we go, Tom?
Honestly, I have no idea. I think that's probably the most complicated part of this is, as I talked about before, about the alignment of kind of internal and external decision-making process, and making sure that we're really considering whole life costs of particular choices. So yeah, I don't know any more than that, really. That's my view. Thanks.
I think I could maybe add to that, because we've spoken to quite a few data owners in this space across various sectors. And I think, as I said in my presentation, it's really hard because people in a working level who you need the data agreement from don't necessarily see the benefit of sharing these things straight away. And I think it's down to having that really senior level mandate between organisations, and also from government signalling that this is necessary. And I think over time, the more you see the benefits and the more you see the evidence of it, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and the more there is an incentives chain. But I think there is a level of top-down mandate needed. So we work a lot with the Transport Research Innovation Board, which brings together strategic transport bodies from across the nation to look at innovation. And one example of that is they developed a digital twin roadmap, and we worked with them on that. And that's to signal across transport bodies, we have one vision, a cross-modal vision for how digital twins can help us in future. And I think it does need that signal cross-organisation to really align those incentive chains. But obviously across sectors, it becomes even harder. When I was talking about the climate resilience demonstrator, the key pain point was actually convincing a water company to share data with a telecoms company as well, which is really critical infrastructure. And I think that's where we found it most hard to align incentives. But actually, if you're able to demonstrate the art of the possible through prototyping and through accessing this data, you know, if this happens, it's going to cost X amount to your network. As soon as you can demonstrate that visually and through these live prototypes, that really helps in unblocking this.
Yeah, and it kind of, Amy, did you want to feed in? Yes, we don't often work in a multimodal fashion, do we? And it was interesting you talking about working with Network Rail. So yes, I welcome your views on this angle.
Yeah, I think as well, it's not just about giving people making sure that organisations have the right incentives, particularly on the kind of data sharing point. It's making sure that particularly local authorities and central government and regional organisations have the capacity and the skills to be able to do that effectively. So I think it kind of links back into the whole point around making sure that the planning system is resourced in the way that it needs to be, and that we've got skilled planners who are able to use this data, who are able to understand it, who are able to share it and use it, that we have those in place. So it's not just about incentives, it's also about capacity as well, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the ultimate goal is that was covered on your slide, Katie, wasn't it? Between we need to build houses. It's a basic human need, and we've got a lack of housing, and we've got to balance that against the decarbonisation agenda and everything else. And that's the kind of the political headache, isn't it, of marrying up those things so that planning is more streamlined and able to deliver what we need.
And just on that, sorry, Emma.
Ed,
So one of the really important things is to make that shift away from talking about just building housing, because that's the sorts of things we can see is that where people are walking more is because they've got a bigger mix of uses, they're closer together. There's other things you can do. And as long as we keep thinking about housing as something separate to development, it's not urban development because it might be a different scale, but it's something about mixed use, development
size housing as well, rather than the 3-bed semis plus,
right.
I think. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going through the next question. Where do I find some comments? What are the most effective tools and policies required for paying for the delivery of infrastructure through the development process? Has anyone got a view on that one in terms of tools for the funding of infrastructure through development? Is that anything anyone's dealt with? No.
I'm happy to share some thoughts. So I think with infrastructure funding, it's actually important not to just look at it at a development level. I think we need to be looking at long-term funding plans, long-term plans for infrastructure, rather than looking at individual developments and saying this needs this to be delivered. So actually, I think it's long-term, and obviously that's for DFT. Our funding is in 5-year periods. I think Network Rails is in 5-year periods. Perhaps it needs to be longer than that.
I think, yeah, just to add on that, we see a very fragmented funding landscape at the moment when it comes to infrastructure delivery, whereas, an infrastructure levy is coming through, set by local authorities, but then you've got the kind of national infrastructure bodies doing different things. You've got, your strategic transport authorities, and then you've got your local authorities doing something different. I think it goes back to the previous question as well, it's an obvious thing to say, but our guidance and funding sits in so many different pots that it adds to, it's not only organizations, it's different guidance, it's different policies, it's different business models that are all adding to this really complex mix. And I know that's not a kind of solution or answer, but it's just to illustrate the scale of the funding problem.
Well, it's a research point, isn't it? I think devolution is going to help with that, hopefully, but it still doesn't take away the fact we've got levelling up bids within that. There's still multiple funding environments, even within the devolved funding environment. Question here for Tom: is Delta compatible with the decide and provide ethos? Is there a risk that predictive models like this reinforce the old predict and provide trap of constant building to meet predicted demand?
Yes, absolutely. It can be used in ways like that. It's really for the user to define the kind of planning inputs and the approach. So the overall scenarios are taken as given, with no attempt to feed back to the kind of population and employment growth, the endogenous conditions like, well, houses are really expensive and people are getting squished into smaller spaces, so actually they're having smaller families. We don't attempt to do that yet. So yeah, the scenarios are taken as given. We have to fit whatever growth is decided as part of that into the model, and that absolutely means that your kind of planning inputs will be affected by the growth that you assume there. So that's part of what the Five research is looking at, is how those different scenario assumptions change and which sites will be brought forward in different views of the world. Yeah, and the way inputs are kind of worked up for the model, it's really again, it's typically in agreement with the model stakeholders, what view of planning inputs you want to take. But yeah, it's a tool for testing, so you can absolutely change and test and mix up the different inputs that are used in a Delta model. Thanks.
Thank you. And then another question towards one of the tools, amenity accessibility index. Can this be used to test how proposed infrastructure would change the accessibility of a location? Does it include active travel?
Short answer is yes, it will do. There'll be two views of it. So one is essentially a heat map of 100 by 100 squares where you're looking at a connectivity index measured between 1 to 100, so it's relative. And the second kind of functionality we envisaged on this was also to assess a particular geographical point and an intervention and how that would change from your baseline score that you would have and what the main drivers would be.
Perfect. Sorry, I'm just clicking through the lots of questions in here. Sorry. Yes, so public transport density seems to be corrupt. Oh dear, it's clicking all over the place. I'm going to go to my other list. Yeah, we've had a lot of comments about public transport and how we integrate that with planning. A question that we had before the session, actually, via the sign up route. Do we have any tools to help us with what makes a bus service self-sustaining? There's been a lot of theory over the years, but very little evidence that new service can be sustained. No one standard nationwide as to what an acceptable level of service is to serve development. I think that, it's quite critical, isn't it? We've talked a lot about walking and cycling, but, how do we ensure that a site should be accessible by public transport and how we sustain that into the future? Who would like to take that one? Ed, is there anything in your tool about public transport?
Sorry, I was just unmuting. Yeah, we've got we can look at it in different ways. The things I was showing earlier were considering how access to public transport infrastructure affects mode share. The bit which is missing, though, is about service and capacity. It's just saying at that stage of thinking, it's about putting the big things in place and saying, is the infrastructure there for people to use? So what proportion of people can get to a bus stop or can get to a station? In the stuff that I showed earlier, that doesn't take the information to say you have to wait 5 minutes for a bus or an hour for a bus or any of those things. We have done more. It's possible to do it. We've done more detailed models in the past, but they tend to be kind of one-offs for particular cities where we can take transport timetable data, we can spatialize it, and we can then look at the time it takes to get from stop to stop. We can then combine that with the other spatial network that people walk through. So you can see actually in 15 minutes, what could you get to through a multimodal journey? So you take 5 minutes to walk to the bus, for example, go on the bus as far as you can in 5 minutes, and then what can you walk to in 5 minutes at the other end? So it's possible to do that. We haven't been looking at the research or the service side of things, though, to say what is the how many people do you need to have using that to sustain it, or how many per hour? We haven't got into those sorts of things. We've really been looking at the kind of physical infrastructure side.
Yeah, do you think the fact of the forever changing routes is a constraint on that, a challenge on that makes that more difficult or undesirable to do?
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the challenges. I think there are other challenges as well, that once you get out of cities, once you get into more rural areas, distances between things become bigger, populations become smaller, and the time between things is bigger as well. So to get to something that is really competitive or as convenient as a kind of a private vehicle is really, really difficult. I think everything becomes about how can you really kind of concentrate growth in the right places where it's as easy as possible to not use a car. and yet there's a whole series of different levels, I think, that come together to affect whether people use the bus or not. Like, where does it go? How often is it? What's it like to wait at the bus stop? All of those kind of questions. It's really difficult in certain places to get it to work.
Yeah. Katie, did you want to? Tom? Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think perhaps more planning audience here than transport modelers, but where we have detailed transport models and we get the sorts of detailed information about costs of travel by different modes, it's a really interesting idea of feeding in that to a kind of a calculation on how sustainable a bus route would be. And with Delta, we can link that up with development and consider kind of potential changes in demand as a result of new development, and how many households will move in, what types of households will be, what's their trip making tendencies. All of those could feed into quite either kind of bespoke or as part of a wider modelling package, the idea of calculating how sustainable a particular bus route would be. So I think it's a really interesting idea.
So you could basically test if you had local plan sites, you could put different site options in, and you could test, for example, a road scheme versus a guided busway or whatever. You can do that within the model. Is that?
Yeah, and like I was saying in Fife, how does that balance play out where car costs have tripled over the next 50 years or halved, or depending on the impact? But yeah, we can test that kind of resilience.
And when you're saying car costs triple, in what sense? I think as we move to EVs, there's lots of thoughts that they're actually going to reduce in cost, aren't they? But theoretically, they could treble by tariffs, say, on fuel. Is that what?
Exactly? Yeah, or road user charging, or let's not get too controversial. But the model is there to test those two versions of the world. And the different demands for different transport modes in those worlds.
Lovely. Katie, do you have anything to add on that or not? On public transport element of things?
I think just hearing that, I think it's a really valid point, the payback periods for, infrastructure investment. And I think that's something we've not looked at in our current work and in the case studies I've talked about today, because we've been taking a national approach. And my view on this would be that you'd have to do it at a very site-specific level, because the conditions and the payback conditions would change based on so many variables that would change across the country. So it's not something we've looked at, but I do think there's probably a definite role for more specific, site-specific models to look at that, and also at a local authority level, but maybe not at a national kind of mandated single way of doing it. I imagine that would be a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, perfect. And just one sum up question for the panel before we draw to a close. We're still talking about challenges in some ways. We've got some excellent tools that show us the right thing to do. Across the panel, then, what do we think is the biggest thing we can make that can make a better transport and land use happen? I'll start with Amy, as your strategic person.
Yeah, I'm going to say well-resourced planning departments and skilled planners.
Perfect. Katie?
Modularity of tools that can interconnect, and the ability for non-technical users to be able to use them, and agreed processes for accountability and incentivization. It's not one thing, sorry.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Tom?
I think, as was alluded to before, the use of these tools much further up in the process, so that we're not scrambling to understand decisions that have already been made and assumed to happen. These tools are there to explore and consider different impacts, and we should use them early on. Thanks.
Perfect. And Ed?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of them, especially use of strategic tools early on. One final kind of maybe a bit more detailed point. There's loads and loads of data about how people get to work. The census is all about how people get to work. There's not the same granularity of data on what people do outside of work. There's things like the National Travel Survey, but that's a bit more qualitative and subjective and not the same thing. It's a big gap that's missing, because we know commuting is what, 15% of journeys to 20% of distance. So it's just a big bit that's missing. Yeah,
excellent. Lovely. Thanks to all our panel members today. Thanks for Landor for facilitating this really interesting, engaging session, and thanks for everybody for joining today. Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye.